Hey guys, Nick Espinoza, your chief security fanatic here. And today I actually want to talk about the protests and the rioting and the looting that we are seeing in America, but from a different angle than a lot of news media is taking it. And so bear with me here because I want to talk about our tech platforms, because our tech platforms are actually being called out for being part of the problem. And obviously this started well before this whole incident, but it is really coming to light and being exacerbated right now. Now, obviously here's what's going on. As you know, since just the awful and horrific death of George Floyd, several American cities have seen everything from peaceful protests to riots and looting. And I am not saying that the protesters are rioting or looting. Looters are looting, protesters are protesting, and there's everybody in between here. Now, much of the media that we have here in the United States is fixated on the demonstrators as well as the looters, etc., in the street, but there is a strong growing concern that is basically coming to light on how our major tech platforms are actually making this situation worse or enabling the worst aspects of society to ramp up to this point. So let's look at some of the issues facing our largest tech platforms in the world here. And we are actually going to start with Reddit, and I'm going to go through with a few of these. Now, Reddit was just actually slammed by their former CEO, Ellen Pao, for amplifying racism and hate. Now, current CEO Steve Huffman says, and he said this on Reddit, that Reddit doesn't tolerate hate, but quite frankly, Pao isn't having it. Huffman said in an open letter to his staff this past Monday, and also published this on Twitter, and I quote, "We do not tolerate hate, racism, and violence, and while we have to work to fight these on our platform, our values are clear." Pao wasn't having that, and Pao then openly criticized Reddit basically this past Tuesday after it published a letter. Pao said on Twitter, "I am obligated to call you out. You should have shut down The Donald," which is a subreddit, "instead of amplifying it and its hate, racism, and violence. So much of what is happening now lies at your feet. You don't get to say Black Lives Matter when Reddit nurtures and monetizes white supremacy and hate all day long." Now, Reddit has been long criticized for not basically ridding its platform of these kinds of forums, especially the subreddit called The Donald, which Pao referred to. Now, this subreddit, The Donald, was formed in 2015 as then candidate Donald Trump announced his candidacy, and this subreddit apparently has a lengthy history of basically playing host to conspiracy theories, as well as a wide array of racist and misogynistic content. This is according to the article that I'm reading from NBC News. Now, in spite of persistent calls to ban this subreddit, The Donald, it has survived, even though it was placed under quarantine in June of 2019, so about a year ago or so, by Reddit. The quarantine prevents the subreddit from appearing in search results and requires users with verified email addresses to opt in to view the content, and I believe that's where it is today. But Reddit is not alone in this, and again, we'll get to the opinion side of this. I am just reading the news from various sources as I have it here. And with that, let's switch over to Twitter, because Twitter has been very fascinating, and this actually started, I think, a little before basically all the protests started, but it really underscores something that Twitter is going through. Now, Twitter on Tuesday, May 26th, basically appended fact-checking labels for the first time in history to two of President Trump's tweets about mail-in ballots, basically rebutting their accuracy, President Trump's accuracy. In response, President Trump accused Twitter of stifling speech and declared that he would put a stop to the interference. 2 days after that, 2 days after Twitter added these fact-checking labels, the president then signed an executive order aimed at weakening protections for social media companies that moderate user content. This is also known as Section 230 of the Communications Decency Act, and I did an entire video on just that last week that I would urge everybody to go see if you want more information there. But Twitter doubled down even after this, and late Wednesday, May 27th, it added fact-checking labels to messages from Chao Lijian, who's a spokesperson for China's foreign ministry, who claimed that the coronavirus outbreak may have begun in the United States and been brought to China by the U.S. military. So obviously, given that hyperbole, Twitter slapped a fact-checking label on that. Twitter also added notices to hundreds of tweets that falsely claimed a photo of a man in a red baseball cap was Derek Chauvin. This is one of the officers involved in the death of George Floyd. And so Twitter labeled that to alert the viewers that the image was manipulated media. During the ramp up of looting and protests, Trump then tweeted, and I quote President Trump, "These thugs are dishonoring the memory of George Floyd, and I won't let this happen. Just spoke to Governor Tim Walz and told him that the military is with him all the way. Any difficulty, and we will assume control. But when the looting starts, the shooting starts. Thank you." Now, that is has some overtones to the 1960s for the the police chief of Miami and all of that. So there are some racial undertones there. But Twitter then flagged that post and limited its spread on its platform with a notice saying, and I quote, "This tweet violated the Twitter rules about glorifying violence. However, Twitter has determined that it may be in the public's interest for the tweet to remain accessible." Now, Twitter is now beginning to take a proactive stance against misinformation and violations of what it considers its terms and policies. Obviously, not just for the president, which, to be honest, in and of itself amazes me that a president would need to be flagged in this manner, but for more people as well, as noticed in hundreds of tweets that it's flagging. So they are becoming more proactive. But people and experts are wondering, like Reddit, where was this years ago as the vitriol basically began invading its platform? I've always said that Twitter is where civility goes to die, and this just underscores the problem. Now, I have more thoughts on this potential censorship, as I'm sure you do, and we will get to that. But next up, let's look at Snapchat, because Snapchat is actually starting to align with Twitter in their policies. Snapchat said on Wednesday, literally today, it would no longer promote President Donald Trump's content in its Discover section. The company said in a statement that it would not, and I quote, "amplify voices who incite racial violence." This is obviously in direction to President Trump, who they are accusing of inciting racial violence, and that is something that President Trump is also being accused of, primarily on Twitter, which is obviously his platform of choice. Now, Snapchat's Discover section typically features content from news organizations, brands, celebrities, and obviously politicians. The president account remains visible on the platform, and anyone can follow his account for updates. And to quote Snapchat, "We are not currently promoting the president's content on Snapchat's Discover platform. We will not amplify voices who incite racial violence and injustice by giving them free promotion on Discover. Racial violence and injustice have no place in our society, and we stand together with all who seek peace, love, equality, and justice in America." Now, this also comes after years of weak security and privacy violations that Snapchat has had, and they received one of the largest fines in the Federal Trade Commission history at the time over these privacy violations, which brings us, and finally, to Facebook. Now, Mark Zuckerberg actually called out Twitter for adding fact-checking to President Trump's tweets. And here we go. In an interview with Fox News' Dana Perino, Zuckerberg differed with Twitter's approach, saying, and I quote, "I just believe strongly that Facebook shouldn't be the arbiter of truth of everything that people say online, and neither should private companies." Now, Zuckerberg said he'd have to understand these proposed regulations, meaning the executive order that President Trump just signed, and said, and I quote, "But in general, I think a government choosing to censor a platform because they're worried about censorship doesn't exactly strike me as the right reflex there." In a nutshell, Facebook is refusing to fact-check posts by highly visible people on its platform, let alone all of its users. Now, the reaction by a good portion of the Facebook community was swift, and almost overnight, satire articles and memes calling Mark Zuckerberg a confirmed child molester began circulating on Facebook. The logic of this protest is, well, because there's no fact-checking on Facebook, this can be a fact now that Mark Zuckerberg is a child molester. And I saw plenty of those articles and memes myself as I post on Facebook publicly as well. So this brings us to the crux of the situation here. And I think this is the question that we really need to be asking ourselves in this situation, as the world is seemingly blowing up around a lot of us here in the United States, and hopefully this insanity will be dying down sooner than later and we can see some actual reform that needs here. But the question is, are these platforms actually open forums with no censorship where anyone can post anything, in which case they're acting as a public forum with no filter beyond any illegal content such as child exploitation or live streaming of crime, but everything else from conspiracy theories to racism and everything in between is allowed? Or are they, as a private company, do they, rather, as a private company, have a moral or ethical obligation to police their own site? I think that's the question. Is it a free-for-all where basically anything goes except the extremely illegal? Or do they, as a private company, should they be monitoring this? Should they be filtering this? That is the question I think we need to answer. And I will give you this on the backdrop. Studies have shown, before you answer me in a post telling me good, bad, or ugly here, studies have shown time and again how we can easily proliferate false information like wildfire through a social media platform and pick up followers who see this false information as a confirmation of their own bias towards one viewpoint or another. Studies have also shown that unless societies become educated on things like logic, identifying dubious sources, and fact-checking, this kind of information can be spread to drive a wedge into society. And the proof is in the pudding. Russia attempted this in Finland about 5 years ago and failed after the Finnish government had a massive education push for its users, and so the candidates that were being secretly backed by Russia, including an explosion in social media posts in Finland supporting that and tearing down every other political party, was able to be overcome by an educated population. China keeps trying to do this as well in Hong Kong, as we've all seen the protests last year, and they are now calling President Trump out on, or rather the United States government on this as well, but they've also been trying it in Taiwan. And Taiwan was also able to rebuff this due to a united push to inform the public on spotting fake news and hyperbole against one of the candidates. That was obviously the candidate China did not want to see, basically making up stories like this person actually lied about having a college degree and other things as well. Taiwan was able to educate its users, and they were able to overcome this false information. We also know that China and Russia are using every single platform I just mentioned here in the United States and other countries to basically drive a wedge, and they are getting a foothold here. And we basically have this problem. We've had it since before social media, which is an anti-intellectualism push, is what I meant to say here, where a lot of people are seeing people that are educated as elite, not necessarily differentiating between, let's say, financial status of education versus financial status of uneducated, and on and on and on. Social media has exploded this issue here, and so there is a huge push to rebuff things like science in the United States, talking about alternative things and all of that. Not to say there's a be all end all to anything, but this is a very serious problem we have here. And so the question becomes, what do we do? That's really it. What do we do with here? I mean, and you can disagree, let's say, with me politically, on the facts. You can have one way or the other, but I think we all need to agree that we have a problem here. And so how do we approach it? How do we fix it? And if you don't think we should fix it, the answer is why. I mean, to me, repealing something like Section 230, I think is horribly incorrect as a move, but also leaving platforms completely unchecked to spread insanity to an uneducated and highly susceptible population is going to tear any society apart in the long run. If that doesn't change, if we are not getting educated or they are not policing or fact-checking, that's going to be a very serious problem. But we may have gone too far for some individuals where, let's say, President Trump gets fact-checked on one thing that, let's say, is demonstrably false, or there is a very serious debate on where he says, I think it's A, and a whole bunch of people say, no, it's B. There are going to be people that are going to look at that fact-check as censorship as opposed to saying, hey, let's talk about this. Let's discuss this. And so I'm very curious to know what goes on here, what we should be doing here. I think it's time for a new plan. We just need to figure out what that is. And I'll be honest, I'm not 100% sure of what that is and where that's going to come from. But if things stay the same, society continues to separate. And I think that's something that we cannot abide. And so with that is your news of the day. And thank you for sticking with me. I think you can hear I'm just slightly under the weather here. And I know this was longer than usual, but it's something important. And as we've all been watching the horror that's been unfolding, in the advent of George Floyd's death, I think it's something that we really need to address, because while we can address, let's say, systemic issues in our society, if we continue to have platforms that proliferate this without any kind of education or fact-checking or something like that, we're just going to keep asking for trouble, and it's just going to keep getting worse. And with that, I'd love to hear thoughts and opinions on this, even if you think I'm an idiot. And please like, share, follow me here on Facebook and Twitter at NickAESP, where I promise you no hyperbole from me. And please feel free to subscribe to me on YouTube as well. And as always, stay safe and stay online. Thanks, guys.